Gorillas are very smart. A captive gorilla named Coco has even learned sign language. Sign language is a special language used by people who cannot hear. Coco can say,
"What?" Annie said loudly. "Sign language? A special language?"
Her voice woke Boo Boo and Ho Ho. They sat up and rubbed their eyes. So? Said Jack.
"Morgan's secret rhyme," said Annie. "Don't you remember?"
She repeated the rhyme.
"To find a special kind of magic in worlds so far apart, speak a special language. Talk with your hands and heart."
Oh, yeah, said Jack.
"I even know a little sign language," said Annie. "In school we learned how to sign 'I love you.'"
Annie held up a closed hand. Slowly she lifted her thumb, index finger, and little finger. She showed the sign to Boo Boo and Ho Ho.
"I love you,"
she said slowly. The small gorillas looked curious. Jack made the sign too. "I love you," he said to Boo Boo and Ho Ho. The two little gorillas stared at Annie and Jack. Then both of them held their hands. They tried to make the same sign.
"They love us too," said Annie.
"Wow," said Jack. He glanced over at Big Guy. The silverback's eyes were open. He was watching them. Jack quickly closed the book. To his relief, the giant gorilla turned over.
"Well,"
said Annie with a sigh,
"I guess that does it."
"We spoke a special language," said Jack. "We talked with our—" Before he could finish his sentence, Boo Boo pushed him. "Whoa," said Jack. He held his little arms above his head. He reared back and charged at Jack. With a flying tackle, he knocked Jack over. "What's going on?" said Jack.
"They want to play with you,"
said Annie. Boo Boo jumped on Jack and put him in a headlock. Jack broke free of the two small gorillas. He jumped up and dashed into the forest. Boo Boo and Ho Ho charged after him. Annie carried Little Guy and followed. She laughed at the small gorillas looking for Jack. Jack hid behind a tree. He pushed his glasses into place. He waited for Boo Boo. In a moment, she walked by. "Boo!" Jack shouted, jumping out. Boo Boo screeched and leaped straight up in the air. Jack cracked up laughing. Boo Boo didn't laugh, though. She bit her lip. She hid her face behind her hands.
"Oh, Boo Boo,"
said Annie. "Don't be scared." She gently put the baby on the ground. She reached out to comfort Boo Boo. Boo Boo wrapped her arms around Annie's neck. She buried her furry head in Annie's shoulder.
"Jack was just playing,"
said Annie. Boo Boo raised her head. She looked at Jack over Annie's shoulder.
"Friends?"
he asked softly. Boo Boo stuck her tongue out at him. Jack laughed. Boo Boo showed her teeth in a big smile. "Friends," said Jack. Just then, Ho Ho started screeching. Jack and Annie looked around. Ho Ho was pointing into the bushes.
"Where's Little Guy?"
said Annie. She and Jack dashed around the shrubs. The baby had crawled to a tree. He was looking up at a branch. A huge, sleek cat with black fur was sitting on the branch. His pale green eyes stared down at the baby gorilla. He looked hungry. "A baby leopard! A black leopard!" breathed Jack. The leopard leaped lightly down from the perch. He faced Little Guy. The baby looked scared.
"No!"
cried Annie. She ran over to the baby gorilla and scooped him into her arms. The leopard let out a snarl. He lowered his head and started slowly towards Annie and the baby. Jack panicked. He didn't know what to do at first. Then he remembered Big Guy's act. Jack took a deep breath. When he let it out, he made a loud, hooting sound. He tore out from the bush. Hooting like a silverback, he ran between Annie and the leopard. Jack grabbed a tree limb and shook it. He ripped leaves from branches. He cupped his hands. He beat his chest. "Roar!" he roared. "Roar!" Then Jack leaned over and charged back and forth past the leopard. Finally, he threw himself on his belly. He began bashing the ground with his palms. He bashed and bashed and bashed.
"Jack!"
Annie called. "Jack!" Jack looked up.
"He's gone,"
Annie said in a quiet voice.
"The leopard's gone. He left a while ago."
"Oh," said Jack. He sat up. He pushed his glasses into place. He looked around. Then he smiled. Chapter 9. Goodbye, Gorillas. Jack couldn't stop smiling. He had scared off a leopard. Boo Boo and Ho Ho stared at Jack with awe. Annie looked at him with awe, too.
"When did you learn to do that?"
she asked. Before Jack could answer, he heard a rustling in the brush. The big guy stepped from the shrubs. The giant gorilla walked silently over to Annie. He took little guy from her and put the baby on his back. Then he touched Annie's cheek gently. Annie grinned at him. Boo Boo and Ho Ho ran to Big Guy and clung to his legs. The giant gorilla barked at the small ones, directing them to come with him. As he walked past Jack, Big Guy stopped. "Hoo, hoo, hoo," he said in a low voice. He reached out toward Jack. Jack ducked, but the silverback patted him on the head. Then he and the small gorillas moved out of sight. Jack felt as if the top of his head were glowing. "Wow," he whispered. "Did you see what he just did?"
Yeah,
said Annie.
he must have watched the show you put on. He was proud of you.
"Well, he was proud of you too," Jack said modestly. Annie nodded, smiling.
"I guess it's time to leave now," she said.
"Leave?" said Jack.
"We have to say goodbye now,"
said Annie. "Goodbye?" said Jack. He didn't want to say goodbye to the gorillas. He loved them. They were totally great.
"Yeah,"
Annie said softly. "Come on." She led the way back through the shrubs around the trees to the clearing. They found all the gorillas awake. Some were stretching and yawning. Others were munching on grass or leaves. The baby was back in his mother's arms. Boo Boo and Ho Ho were chattering away to their moms. "They probably were telling them what I did," Jack thought. He and Annie walked over to the big guy and stood in front of him. The other gorillas gathered around.
"We have to go now,"
Annie said to all of them. "We have to say goodbye," said Jack.
"Thanks for letting us be part of your family,"
said Annie. She and Jack held up their hands and waved. The gorillas looked sad. They murmured soft sounds. Big Guy lifted his hands in the air as if he were about to wave. But instead, the silverback raised his thumb and his index finger and little finger. "I love you," the giant gorilla signed. Jack couldn't believe his eyes. Annie signed back, "I love you." Jack signed too. The silverback stared at them for a long moment with a gentle, shy look. Then he turned away and gave a short bark to his family. All the gorillas lined up behind him. The baby's mother held her baby close. Ho Ho rode piggyback on his mom. Boo Boo held her mom's hand. The silverback started away from the clearing. The others followed. Boo Boo was the only one who looked back. She screeched and waved at Jack and Annie. Then she walked away out of sight. Jack couldn't talk. His heart was too full. He took a few steps in the direction of the gorillas.
"Hey,"
said Annie.
"you're going the wrong way."
Jack looked back at her.
"The treehouse is over there,"
she said. She pointed in the opposite direction at the treehouse peeking out from the fog. Jack sighed. Then he turned and started to follow her out of the clearing.
"Oh, don't forget this,"
said Annie. She leaned over and picked up Jack's backpack from the grass. She handed it to him. "Thanks," he said. They kept walking.
"And don't forget this,"
said Annie. She picked up Jack's jacket from under a tree. She handed it to him. "Thanks," said Jack. He tied his jacket around his waist. They kept walking.
"And don't forget these."
She pointed to the flashlight and umbrella. They lay in the grass under the wide mossy limbs of a fat tree. Annie picked them up and carried them herself. It started to drizzle again just as she and Jack got to the rope ladder. They climbed up into the tree house. When they got inside, reading, they looked out the window. Jack hoped to catch one last glimpse of the gorilla family, but there was nothing to see. A white mist covered the cloud forest. Annie picked up the Pennsylvania book. She pointed to a picture of Frog Creek woods. "I wish we could go home," she said. Suddenly a joyous screech rang out. The happy, wild sound shot through the white mist, through the cool rain, straight into Jack's heart. He opened his mouth to answer the call of the gorillas, but it was too late. The wind began to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Chapter 10. A Special Magic. Tap, tap, tap. Jack opened his eyes. The Frog Creek woods were still dark and rainy.
"We're home,"
said Annie. Jack sighed. "I miss them already," he said.
"Me too,"
said Annie.
"Did you take a lot of notes of their habits and behavior?"
Jack shrugged. "I listed a few things about them," he said. "But sometimes lists don't tell you much. You have to love gorillas to really know them."
"Yeah, that's right,"
said Annie. Jack opened his backpack. He pulled out their research book and put it in the corner. Then he pulled out the twig that Ho Ho had given him. He smiled as he showed it to Annie. "I promised Ho-Ho I'd eat this later," he said, "but I think we should save it for Morgan instead."
Good idea, said Annie. It'll prove to her that we found a special magic.
"Yeah, gorilla magic," said Jack.
The magic of all animals, said Annie.
"Yeah," said Jack. He placed the twig next to the scrolls they had brought back from Old England.
Let's go,
said Annie. She started down. Jack pulled on his backpack. He put the flashlight in his pack. Then he grabbed the umbrella and followed Annie. They started through the Frog Creek woods. It was still cool and dark and rainy. Jack didn't mind, though. He put on his jacket. He didn't take out the flashlight. He didn't put up the umbrella. Jack felt as if he weren't completely human yet. There was still a bit of gorilla left in him. "Ho, ho, ho," he said in a low voice.
"Boo, boo,"
Annie said back. "Ha, ha, ha," they said together. Gorillas are the biggest members of the group of animals we call primates. Other primates include chimpanzees, orangutans, gibbons, baboons, monkeys, and humans. All gorillas live in Africa. There are 3 groups of gorillas: western lowland gorillas, eastern lowland gorillas, and mountain gorillas. Mountain gorillas are the largest gorillas. They have longer hair and longer jaws and teeth than lowland gorillas. Mountain gorillas live in the volcanic mountains of Virunga in Central Africa. The word Virunga means a lonely mountain that reaches to the clouds. Gorillas are mainly herbivores or plant eaters. They keep on the move so they will not deplete a feeding area. A silverback gorilla can eat up to 50 pounds of forest vegetation in only one day. All gorillas are on the endangered species list, but the ones most threatened are the mountain gorillas. Fewer than 650 still live in the wild. None live in captivity. A woman named Diane Fossey lived for almost 20 years with the mountain gorillas. During her life, she fought very hard for their protection. Since 1971, a lowland gorilla named Coco has been part of a gorilla language project in California. Gorillas will never be able to talk like people because their vocal cords cannot make the necessary range of sounds. But a woman named Penny Patterson taught Coco the gorilla how to use American Sign Language. American Sign Language is a special language using hand gestures. It is primarily used by people who are unable to hear. Coco has learned to make more than 1,000 signs, and she understands about 2,000 English words. She proves that gorillas have extraordinary intelligence, as well as many thoughts and feelings similar to those of humans.